On today's World Insight with Tian Wei, the U.S. test of mid-range cruise missiles after the U.S. withdrew from the INF Treaty, the immediate impact, and a diplomatic row over the idea of an unsolicited sale of Greenland. Why the fuss over the world's biggest island? And here's our host, Tian Wei.
Hello and welcome to World Insight, coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We begin today's program with the Pentagon's announcement earlier of a U.S. cruise missile test over the weekend. The missile, launched from an island off the coast of California, has a range of 500 kilometers. It would have been banned under the Immediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, which the U.S. pulled out of just 2 weeks ago. Russia and China expressed regrets over the test. Before we get down to the latest discussion about its impact, take a look at this first.
Test for missile capability, sparking a new arms race? Recently, the Pentagon announced the test of a medium-range ground-launched cruise missile, which took place early Sunday at San Nicolas Island off the California coast. The missile, which was not nuclear-equipped, hit its target after flying more than 500 kilometers. Officials said the test will provide more data to America's development of intermediate-range capabilities. The test came just weeks after the U.S. tore up the Intermediate-Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Cold War-era pact with Russia, eliminating such potentially nuclear-capable weapons. Moscow has accused the United States of ramping up military tensions and finds the timing of the test suspicious.
The Americans have tested this missile too quickly after having withdrawn from the treaty. That gives us strong reason to believe that they had started work to adapt the sea-launched missile long before they began looking for excuses to opt out of the treaty.
China has warned that missile tests could lead to a new arms race.
The U.S. move will trigger a new round of arms race and escalation of military confrontation, which will have a serious negative impact on the international and regional security situation.
The U.S. and Russia formally withdrew from the INF earlier this month. Washington claimed Moscow was violating the treaty. Moscow has denied the accusation. The landmark 1987 pact prohibited the two countries from possessing, producing, or testing a ground-launched cruise missile with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers, which has kept nuclear missiles out of Europe for 3 decades. But with the death of the INF, the U.S. could deploy new land-based mid-range nuclear missiles. The United Nations Security Council will go on an emergency meeting to talk about the treaty.
So could the U.S. mid-range missile test spark a nuclear arms race? How about the reactions coming from the international community? Let's loop in our panelist in Washington, D.C., in the U.S., Professor Peter Kuznick, who is the director of the Nuclear Studies Institute at the American University in D.C. In Moscow, we invited Anton Fedashin, a professor of history at the American University there. And in our Beijing studio, last but not least, Cui Hongjian, director of Department of European Studies from China Institute of International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. Professor Kuznick, go to you first. What does that mean, the cruise missile test over the weekend? It's said both the data and the experiences learned is likely to feed the future development of missiles from the U.S. What does that mean?
The United States has embarked on a very aggressive nuclear buildup program. This really began under Obama, when Obama announced a 30-year, trillion-dollar nuclear modernization program. We know that it's really $1.7 trillion. And then Trump has taken this program and run with it. In February 2018, he announced his new nuclear posture review, which is a very aggressive approach toward building up America's nuclear arsenal. And he surrounded himself with advisors who don't believe in arms control. John Bolton is the #1 example. Pompeo, Tim Morrison, these people are all nuclear hawks, and they think the United States can outspend outbuild, outdeploy the rest of the world when it comes to nuclear weapons. So what we're on is the verge of a new nuclear arms race. And when we think about what that means, we go back to the 1980s.
Right.
In the 1980s, the world had close to 70,000 nuclear weapons. I mean, this is insane. We've got about 14,000 now, which is also insane. But the possibility of the kind of buildup that some of the hawks around Trump envision is very frightening.
I see. Professor Pidashian, based in Moscow, help us to understand how the Russians now are looking at the latest situation. Of course, the Russian president, as earlier showed in our background, are talking about it, the timing as suspicious now. Is this going to lead a further escalation of building of nuclear arms also in Russia, as we heard some of the earlier failure recently?
Well, you know, the response from Moscow was that we told you so, in the sense that the American argument for withdrawing from the treaty and blaming the Russians for having broken its conditions was simply pretext for the United States moving ahead with what had already been in development before the U.S. started pushing for the end of the treaty. So far, the Russian reaction has been, this is exactly what we predicted, and now we see, by the timing, that the Americans had started developing weapons that had been banned by the INF before. Now, on the other side, Putin and the Russians understand that they cannot outspend the Americans in terms of developing their nuclear weapons. Moreover, there seems to be a consensus here in Moscow that Russia has enough nuclear weapons. And as long as intermediate range nuclear weapons aren't placed in Europe, especially in Eastern European countries, right on Russia's borders, I haven't heard any aggressive talk in trying to match the Americans just for the sake of matching the Americans. But let's define, you know, the concepts of an arms race and arms development. The Russians have also been modernizing their nuclear weapons, but this was a process that was driven by the budget that they had allocated. We'll know whether this turns into an arms race when the budgets will become driven by the process itself, for the sake of itself. That hasn't happened yet from the Russian perspective, but we'll see.
Okay.
And the last thing I want to mention, Tianwei, is that a lot depends on what the Europeans will decide, because Putin was just in France and then in Helsinki. So far, the Europeans have not jumped on the bandwagon to open up their territory for American medium-range missiles. Everyone in Europe understands that once they place those there, once they place those there, they will become targets for Russian missiles. And I don't think there's really much of a thirst for that yet. There is, however, an argument for the fact that the U.S. pullout is really aimed at China, and that the first U.S. missiles, should they be deployed, intermediate range missiles, will go somewhere into Asia. We'll see what happens. Let's
ask the Chinese and the Asian guest, Mr. Cui, sitting here, listening to your two colleagues from U.S. and Russia, talking about the impact. What about for China? China, of course, has said so-called quote-unquote zero tolerance if intermediate range missiles being deployed by the United States in the territory. So what does that mean, Mr. Cui?
Certainly. I think from China's perspective, firstly, of course, as one of the bigger stakeholders, China firstly concerned the possible, arms race and nuclear race on the level of global. And secondly, of course, China take care of the any negative impact on the regional, stability and peace. Also, for a long time in Asia region, there is not so hot, nuclear weapon issue, of course, except the DPRK. Yes. But of course, now the question is, once the American try to deploy some more, middle-range missile in Asia, certainly, I think China would be targeted.
Now, so Mr. Cui, if I could ask you just to follow up, earlier there was the THAAD issue 2 years ago when the U.S. was trying to deploy that in South Korea, and that has led to a an escalation of tension between China and South Korea as neighbors. Now, China has made it very clear, zero tolerance, and none of the countries in China's neighborhood has expressed willingness to deploy these kinds of intermediary range missiles from the United States after the Defense Ministry visiting Asia from the U.S. So will this be a no-no zone, or allies of the U.S. will have a second thought for one reason or another, Mr. Cui?
I think this time, I think it's different from last time you mentioned it in South Korea.
How and why?
Because last time, American side, declined that, okay, it's just a defensive, missile. As we know, it's an anti-missile system. But this time, as we know, the middle-range missile would be an aggressive weapon. So I think it's different in nature. Of course, so far, I think in Asia, not only in China, take a very strong opposition to a possible deploy of the missile from the United States. And also some other regional countries, I don't think they are clever enough to understand once they are maybe the first middle-range missile deployed in Asia. Perhaps there will be some response from China, and other regional countries will become the victims for any possible nuclear risk.
I see China and Russia already in joint military exercises recently. Some suggest that Professor Fedashian, it had something to do with the recent U.S. actions regarding the INF Treaty and now the test of the cruise missiles. What do you say?
Well, I think there's a whole range of connections. Russia and China have been deepening their military cooperation for general geopolitical, geostrategic reasons. There's a reason why Henry Kissinger has been the most vocal and consistent critic both of the Obama administration's and the Trump administration's policy towards both Russia and China, because he's, in his old age, he's seeing the work that he and Nixon had done in the 1970s to pull them apart and make both, or rather each, more dependent on the U.S. than they were on each other. He's seeing all of this work being undone. Whether the military exercises are a direct response to the U.S. pullout out of the INF, I seriously doubt it, because this core cooperation actually began before the United States officially announced its withdrawal. Will that become a factor in what's going on? Of course it will be. There's a big difference, however, between the arms race as it may begin to develop now and what was happening in the early and middle of the 1980s, as Peter referred to earlier. Back then, the West Europeans had a fairly good reason to be concerned about the Soviet Union. It had a preponderant conventional weapons force in Eastern Europe, which was still part of the Soviet Empire. It really did present a threat to Western Europe, or at least you could credibly argue that it did. Nowadays, of course, there is no ideological competition between Russia and the United States, certainly not one that threatens Europe directly. So again, as our colleague in Beijing also mentioned, a lot will depend on what the countries where the U.S. may want to place these missiles will ultimately decide, and whether those governments will want to make themselves a target for either Chinese or Russian missiles for the sake of promoting America. You know, back in the 1980s, the American idea was protecting the world. Now it's America first.
Professor Fedashian, we would love to have your opinions and insights, but let me have also another share of time from Professor Kuznick. Now, Professor, we know that the UN Security Council is likely to host a session about the recent missile launch, a cruise missile launch by the U.S., and certainly the collapse of the IMF and its potential impact. What the world can do, given the fact that it is very much divided these days in terms of how multilateral platform, even the UN included, is likely to exercise its joint consensus?
We face a very, very serious crisis globally right now. And part of the problem is that there is no international leadership. Certainly the United States has abrogated that role. And we don't see anybody else stepping up to the plate to take that responsibility now. I'm glad they're talking this afternoon at the United Nations Security Council. What we have to try to do is preserve the New START Treaty. The last piece of the nuclear architecture, the arms control architecture that was put into place is the New START Treaty.
Right.
The New START Treaty expires in February 2021. Trump has already indicated his unlikeliness to go ahead and extend it. Bolton, his main advisor on these issues, has denounced the New START Treaty. So the New START Treaty puts a limit on the number of nuclear warheads that each country can deploy, 1,550. If that goes away, then there's no arms control agreements at all left anymore.
No.
We have to remember that in January 2018, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists experts put the hands of the doomsday clock at 2 minutes before midnight. The closest has been since the early 1950s, when the United States and Soviet Union tested their hydrogen bombs. The Soviet Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabakov has since then said that now he thinks it's 1 minute before midnight. So we're desperately in need of international leadership now. And if Xi can stand up and do this, and Putin, you know, maybe that Trump can be isolated globally. The Europeans were not happy when the United States pulled out of the INF Treaty. They were not happy when the United States withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA.
Right.
They're very unhappy with America's aggressive behavior, but they have not stood up and provided any leadership yet.
Professor Kuznick, I want to follow up because you are well known in your professional career about the production of something called the Untold History of the United States on the public service in the United States. Now, among them, there are stories regarding non-proliferation. People remember during the Cold War era and even years after that, what that has done, the competition of arms race in the world. But now, do you think there's still enough awareness of that in the U.S., or those important topics have been taken away from people's attention by some of the hilarious political dramas that is going on inside your country? How to wake people's attention up again about that, which you have been doing for decades?
I've been trying to do for decades.
I know you've been
not
trying
always
to do
successfully. Yeah, not always successfully. But the problem is that nuclear weapons are not on people's radar right now. I mean, the young people, the students who Anton and I teach, are very concerned about global warming, climate change. They've got a lot of concern about certain issues, but then almost no discussion of nuclear issues. There's really almost no discussion of foreign policy in the United States. The fact that the United States is now bombing 9 different countries does not get discussed. That we're in a state of permanent warfare, that relations with the United States and Russia and the United States and China have deteriorated so markedly in recent years. When Oliver Stone and I released Untold History in the late 2012, early 2013, the hands of the doomsday clock were 8 minutes before midnight. Now it's down to 2 minutes before midnight, and I think that's an accurate assessment. So yes, it's a struggle to get people to focus. Even in Democratic primary debates right now, there's almost no discussion of foreign policy. So this is a serious problem.
I see alongside here in the studio, when I'm facing with the Chinese guest, Mr. Cui, obviously you heard what your 2 colleagues just said. Now, there is the geopolitical competition, certainly, between China and the United States. Whether China likes it or wants to have it or not, it's just a matter of fact. So, Mr. Cui, does it mean that China will have to participate in this arms race if the U.S. continues? Of course, there might be also other hidden agenda by Washington, for example, selling arms and also selling anti-missile systems at the same time. So what will China do, really, particularly if you have a neighbor in which there is a Korean Peninsula nuclear issue boiling still?
I think from China's perspective, firstly, China still has tried its best to do something to help, this trend to go back to the normal way. As we know, as we understand that China still, propose some more economic cooperation and especially some geo-economic cooperation like BRI or some other. But of course, at the same time, I think that China have to develop its capability. Yeah. Of course, maybe mostly in a defensive way. For example, how about this zero tolerance to any deployment of the middle-range missile from the United States in Asia? I think China firstly should try to convince regional countries to do something more and to have some more mutual trust with regional countries. And then, of course, China need to try to find a developed regional network in security and to promote this more mutual trust. I think that would be more constructive way for China.
Professor Fedashian, we have a minute and a half to go before we wrap it up. Do you think there might be some new consensus? Earlier we had the foreign ministers from China, Japan, and South Korea sitting together at a crucial time. Of course, there are still a lot of differences going on, but security issue will sometime pop up in the discussion. Professor Fedashian, do you think that would happen in the way of the new framework to limit the impact of the recent development?
I think that's exactly what's going to happen, because the only way to prevent proliferation from reaching uncontrollable proportions is actually for regional cooperation to deepen, which of course is exactly what the Trump administration doesn't want. But let's remember the difference between the Cold War back then and today. Back in the late 20th century, the United States could actually argue that it was defending the Western world against an ideological threat, and therefore countries were willing to become targets for the Soviet Union because they considered their own interests to be defended better by the United States and the deployment of its weapons. These days, things are different, and if you look at the narrative of the Trump administration, this is about America first. It's not about American leadership of the Western world against an existential global threat, the way that communism had been before. I don't see why any country would want to sign up to host American weapons when the narrative out of the White House is that this is being done for American security purposes, and that's exactly what Bolton's idea of international relations is. And I urge your viewers to read his 2008 memoir, Surrender is Not an Option, where he lays out his vision of a world order, and it's the United States first and everyone second. I don't see how any country
we are running out of time.
will host weapons in that.
We are running out of time. I'm not sure whether many people will be really interested in reading his book, but certainly this is a very important topic that the three of you have been helping us to see some real insight. Thank you so much, Anton Fedashian, Peter Kuznick, last but not least, Cui Hongjian. Really appreciate it, gentlemen. Thank you so much.